Here's the thing the financial press is not telling you. Right now, at this exact moment in history, the United States is raising tariffs on Chinese goods to levels not seen since the Great Depression. And China is simultaneously cutting tariffs on hundreds of product categories. Curious, moving in the opposite direction. Deliberately, quietly, while the cameras are pointed somewhere else. You have probably been told this is a trade war. Two countries punching each other, tit for tat. But that explanation has always felt incomplete, hasn't it? Because a war implies both sides are reacting. And what I have traced through the policy documents, the Federal Reserve research, and the industrial planning papers is that only one side is reacting. Thoughtful, the other one is executing. And there is a third story inside this one that almost no one is covering. While these two giants fight over tariffs, they are quietly dismantling the dollar's grip on global trade. And nobody is explaining that part. By the end of this video, I want you to feel something specific. Not anxiety, not outrage. The feeling you get when someone finally explains the trick behind a magic trick you've been watching for years, and suddenly everything you saw before makes perfect sense. I will be honest with you about where I stand on this. After studying this for a long time, I have come to a clear conclusion. Thoughtful, China is winning this particular contest. Not because it is more powerful in absolute terms, but because it is playing a fundamentally different game. One with a longer time horizon. One that most Western analysts are measuring with the wrong instruments. I say that not to take a political side. I say it because I think it is the most honest reading of what the data actually shows. Sincere, and I think you deserve the honest reading, not the comforting one. Here is the argument in 2 sentences. Thoughtful, China is not cutting tariffs because it has become more open. It is cutting tariffs on exactly the inputs it needs to become permanently self-sufficient in the industries that will define the next 50 years. And the unintended consequence of American tariff escalation is that it is not just failing to stop that process. It is funding it through a mechanism that runs directly through the dollar itself. Start with the raw data, because this is where most analysis stops and calls it a day. Curious. The United States, between January and August of 2025, raised its average effective tariff rate from roughly 2.5% to over 14% on all imports, according to the Penn-Wharton budget model. On Chinese goods specifically, rates briefly exceeded 100% before a negotiated truce brought them back toward 10% by May of 2025. Meanwhile, on January 1st of 2026, China implemented its annual tariff adjustment. It reduced import duties on 935 product categories to levels below what international trade rules even require. Surprised, 935 categories. Selectively, precisely, with a list that reads less like a trade liberalization document and more like a national procurement order. Thoughtful, think about what it means to go shopping for your own country's industrial future. Look at your long-term manufacturing roadmap, and then lower the cost of every input your factories need to build it. That is not free trade ideology. That is supply-side strategy wearing the costume of openness. The items on China's 2026 reduced tariff list are the key. Recycled black powder for lithium-ion battery production, cut from 6.5% to 3%. Unroasted pyrite for battery materials, cut to 0. Components for intelligent bionic robots, newly added as a distinct category. Bioaviation kerosene, semiconductor fabrication inputs, healthcare materials aligned with the 15th five-year plan. Thoughtful. According to analysis from rare earth exchanges, this is fine-tuned trade management. Easing imports where needed while preserving export controls on strategic outputs. Every single cut is aimed at lowering the cost of what China still needs from abroad in order to complete an industrial infrastructure designed to need less from abroad permanently. Curious. Imagine a chess player who imports the best pieces, assembles a formation no opponent has ever seen, and then refuses to export those pieces to anyone else. That is the operational logic here. To understand why this divergence exists now, you have to understand what the original deal was. When China joined the WTO in 2001, the implicit Western bet was this: trade produces prosperity, prosperity produces a middle class produces political liberalization. Thoughtful, the trade relationship was a wager on convergence. That contract is broken, not in a dramatic moment, but incrementally, through 2 decades of industrial policy that the United States government documented in its own annual National Trade Estimate reports without ever acting on decisively. Frustrated, the Trump administration, looking at those reports in 2025, held one up publicly and called it 40 years of documented inaction. Here is what the broken contract actually broke: the assumption that economic integration creates mutual dependency that prevents strategic competition. What it actually created was a transfer of industrial knowledge, supply chain architecture, and manufacturing scale from west to east at a speed and volume that no one in Washington was politically incentivized to slow down while it was happening. Here is the part of this story that the mainstream financial press is almost entirely ignoring, and it is the part one find most significant. Thoughtful, when the United States imposes tariffs at scale, it forces countries around the world to make a calculation. Do I want to keep absorbing the costs of a dollar-denominated trade system that can be weaponized against my supply chains at any moment? The answer, increasingly, is no. And China has been quietly building the infrastructure for the alternative for years. It has 24 active free trade agreements covering 34 countries. It is extending zero tariff treatment to 43 least developed countries. Curious, it is anchoring regional supply chains in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Latin America through financing and trade frameworks that settle in currencies other than the dollar. The Federal Reserve's own economists published data in March of 2026 showing that China's trade surplus reached a record $1.2 trillion in 2025, exceeding 6% of its GDP. That surplus is not sitting in dollar reserves the way it used to. The composition of China's reserve management and the payment systems its trading partners are adopting is gradually shifting the plumbing of global trade. American tariffs did not cause this, but they accelerated it. Every escalation makes the case for de-dollarization inside a foreign finance ministry more compelling, not as ideology, as risk management. Picture what happens when a landlord raises the rent every few months without warning. At some point, tenants stop renewing the lease, not because they hate the landlord, but because the unpredictability itself has become the problem. That is what American tariff policy has communicated to the world about dollar-denominated trade. The World Economic Forum noted in February 2026 that China's 15th five-year plan defines this moment as a critical transitional phase. Thoughtful, the explicit goals include self-reliance in semiconductors, advanced robotics, battery technology, and aerospace. These are precisely the sectors where American export controls and tariffs have been most aggressive. Pause. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission published a detailed assessment in November 2025 concluding that China met or exceeded many of the ambitious targets it set for itself in 2015 under its industrial master plan. Chinese firms accounted for nearly 1/4 of global export growth in the 10 strategic sectors targeted, in the same period when American pressure was supposedly constraining them. Curious, the pressure produced the response it was designed to prevent. That is not a partisan observation. It is the forensic record of what happened. There is a third actor in this story that almost every analysis ignores: the Global South. The countries that are not aligned exclusively with Washington or Beijing, that are right now receiving both a phone call and a bill from both directions. Curious, China's offer: preferential tariffs, infrastructure financing, supply chain integration, payment systems that bypass the dollar. America's offer: security alliances, technology access, and the implicit promise that the rules-based order will hold, paired with tariffs that apply to allies and adversaries alike. Thoughtful, the countries choosing between these offers are not making an ideological choice. They are making a supply chain and financing calculation. And the direction of those calculations, aggregated across dozens of emerging economies, is what will actually determine whether the dollar remains the language of global commerce in 2040. The United States has 3 real options right now, and none of them are clean. Thoughtful, the first is continued escalation through new Section 301 investigations, launched in March 2026, targeting excess capacity and forced labor. The cost is further retaliation, supply chain disruption for American businesses, and continued acceleration of China's self-reliance and de-dollarization timelines. The second option is a durable negotiated framework, going beyond the tactical truces of 2025 to address industrial subsidies, technology transfer, and market access simultaneously. Pause. The cost is political. Any deal that does not visibly look like an American win is nearly impossible to sell domestically. The third option is strategic patience. Use the time bought by current agreements to rebuild domestic industrial capacity, align with allies, and wait for China's internal pressures. Weak consumer demand, demographic decline, property sector overhang, to force a different kind of conversation. The risk is that China's industrial and financial infrastructure is built before American alternatives are ready. China, for its part, is playing a longer game with fewer domestic political constraints on its timeline. But it is not invulnerable. Its continued reliance on Western semiconductor equipment for advanced chip fabrication is the one area where the self-reliance project has not yet closed the loop. And a trade surplus of $1.2 trillion is generating the kind of international friction that even Beijing cannot ignore indefinitely. Scenario 1. Negotiated equilibrium. A formal U.S.-China framework, building on the Busan Summit of October 2025, produces a multi-year agreement that stabilizes tariff rates and addresses subsidies. Thoughtful, the de-dollarization trend slows but does not reverse. This is the scenario markets have been pricing as possible since the November 2025 truce extension. Pause. Scenario 2. Manage competition. Tariffs remain elevated but predictable. The world organizes into two partially overlapping trade ecosystems. Curious de-dollarization continues at a moderate pace, driven not by ideology but by infrastructure, payment systems, swap lines, commodity pricing mechanisms that simply work better for countries outside the dollar core. Scenario 3. Renewed escalation. The Section 301 investigations produce findings that trigger new tariffs. China's Ministry of Commerce investigations into U.S. trade practices produce countermeasures. Size. The May 2026 summit fails to produce a framework. The 2025 truce unravels. Capital flight from dollar assets, which already appeared in nascent form in early 2026 when bond yields rose and gold surged, accelerates. Scenario 4. Technological and financial bifurcation. Semiconductor controls, rare earth restrictions, and competing payment infrastructure produce a genuine split, not just in manufacturing supply chains, but in the financial architecture of global trade. Two systems, two standards. Switching costs become prohibitive. The dollar's reserve status does not collapse, but it becomes one of two reserve systems rather than the only one. I know a lot of you watching this are skeptical of the mainstream financial media, and honestly, I think that skepticism is earned. Thoughtful, because what I have just walked you through is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented in Federal Reserve research notes, in IMF data, in the policy documents of both governments. The information exists. It is just rarely assembled in a way that connects the tariff schedule to the dollar to the global south to your supply chain or your savings. Pause. Here is what I want you to take away that is actually useful. If you are in a country that is not the United States or China, you are sitting on the most valuable piece of leverage in this entire story. Your country's choice of which supply chain to integrate into, which payment system to use, which infrastructure to finance. Those choices are being made right now, in finance ministries and trade offices, sometimes with very little public debate. Curious, if you are a business owner, the question is not which side wins. The question is, which supply chain dependency are you building, and how reversible is it? If you are an investor, the question is not which currency survives. The question is, what is a world with two reserve systems instead of one due to the assets you currently hold? The people who got ahead of major structural shifts in the past were not the ones with the best predictions. They were the ones who understood the direction of the underlying forces early enough to position before the crowd. That is why I make these videos. Not to tell you what to think, to show you what is actually moving. So here is what we have traced. China is not cutting tariffs because it became a free trader. It is lowering the cost of exactly the inputs it needs to complete an industrial infrastructure designed to make it permanently less dependent on everyone else. Thoughtful, the 935 product categories are a procurement list for a state-managed transition towards self-reliance. The United States is raising tariffs with a logic that is not irrational, but with consequences that its own policy documents acknowledge are unpredictable. The pressure to decouple has produced a Chinese industrial response that is accelerating the very self-reliance it was designed to prevent. Curious, and the secondary effect, the one running through currency systems, reserve management, and the financial plumbing of global trade, is the story that most people covering tariffs have not yet connected to what they are already covering about de-dollarization. Serious, the contract that defined the post-1990 global trade order is broken. What replaces it is being written right now, in tariff schedules, in free trade agreements, in payment system negotiations that happen without press conferences. The question is whether you are watching it happen or understanding it well enough to think ahead of it. Here is my question for you, and I genuinely want to read your answer. Do you think the dollar's role in global trade will look meaningfully different in 10 years? And what would it take to change your mind either way? Leave it in the comments.